Good afternoon. I think we'll get started a couple minutes late, but letting people trickle in. For our panel discussion on beneficial ownership, the way we have agreed to structure this, we want to make sure that we have this framed as a discussion with plenty of time at the end for your questions and your engagement in the discussion. So I think we'll just each briefly introduce ourselves. We have a longer bio in the conference agenda, but just so you have a sense of who we are. And then I'm going to give a very brief background of how we got to this point, the last year and a half or so in the international realm, beneficial ownership, and there's been a number of developments. And then we've agreed upon a set of questions, which I'll moderate only because we don't actually have a chair, but all three of us are very equally engaged on this issue, so I will ask the questions, but also be an active participant. So I'm not actually in the chair role. So just to kick things off, my name is Joseph Kraus, based in Washington, D.C. I work for a non-governmental organization called the One Campaign, which works globally to eradicate poverty, specifically in Africa. And I work on transparency and accountability issues, which is how I came to this issue.
Good afternoon. I'm Gonzalo Jalles. I'm the CEO of Cayman Finance.
Good afternoon. My name is Glenford, Malone, and I work for the Financial Services Commission of the BVI, and effectively I'm a regulator with AML background and that type of good stuff.
Great. So just to get things started, to give a brief introduction on the issue and recent international developments. Quite a bit has happened in this space, especially in the last 12 or 13 months. So how did we get to this point? For a number of years, there have been a number of civil society organizations that have been, a number of whom I work with, who have been working on this issue in the U.S., in Europe, and beyond. In the U.S., there's been legislation sitting in Congress for the past 6 years, led by Senator Levin from Michigan. That legislation has never passed out of committee, so it essentially has languished and not gone anywhere. So there hasn't been a lot of traction on this issue. That all changed. If you had to sort of pick a date or put a date to when a major development happened, it was April 4th of 2013. Which was the day that the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists based in Washington, D.C. began reporting on a years-long investigation into information they had received from the British Virgin Islands, the Cook Islands, and a number of other offshore financial centers. That was information that was leaked to them, 2.5 million files involving more than 120,000 companies. So this made a big splash beginning on April 4th of last year when a number of newspapers simultaneously began publishing stories based on the information that they had received. That investigation and that reporting continues. It involved dozens of countries, journalists from dozens of countries. I think they had more than 80 journalists involved in this. It really, in a way, was a game changer in terms of putting this issue on the on the radar screens of policymakers and governments. A number of governments responded immediately asking for this information. They wanted access to the files. Germany, Greece, the United States, France, Canada, a number of others. The Canadian government actually threatened to sue the organization when they refused to give the information to them. ICIJ's response was, your governments, if you want access to this information, change your laws so you get it. They're journalists and didn't think it was their obligation to reveal the information that they had. In May of last year, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which is a voluntary initiative aimed at increasing transparency in the oil, gas, and mining sectors, issued its new set of standards for countries that report on natural resource payments. And as part of that, it was encouraged that implementing countries include information about the beneficial ownership. A number of countries that are members of the EITI are now working on adopting that new standard, including the beneficial ownership component of it. The G8 last year, David Cameron, as the UK was the president of the G8 last year, David Cameron really wanted to make transparency one of the focal points of the G8 summit last year. The 3 T's, as they call it, tax, transparency, and trade. Beneficial ownership was part of that agenda. As an outcome of the G8 summit last year, and part of the G8 communique, all then 8 members of the G8 agreed to issue national action plans specifically on beneficial ownership, which did happen. And interestingly, a number of all of the overseas territories and a number of the Crown dependencies also agreed to issue national action plans and did so. The UK government then moved forward with a public consultation on beneficial ownership, whether to have a central registry of information and then to make that information public, which they did over the summer and into the fall of last year, concluding with an announcement October 30th of last year at the Open Government Partnership by David Cameron announcing that the UK government would in fact issue or move towards a public registry of beneficial ownership information. Then the European Union, which is working to revise and update its anti-money laundering directive, of course, is also making this one of the central features. And it's an ongoing process. There's no final position yet, but it is interesting to note that in March of this year, the European Parliament approved a position that would require that information be publicly available for companies, trusts, and similar legal structures. That position by the European Parliament now needs to go through the rather complex bureaucratic process of being approved by the European Commission and by the Council of Ministers, which is an ongoing process, probably won't be settled until later this year at the very earliest. And then most recently, the overseas territories and Crown dependencies of the UK government, under great pressure from the UK, it should be noted, has been, a number of them have issued and been going through public consultations on whether to have central registries of beneficial ownership information, and a couple of them have included language about whether that information should then be made public. The British Virgin Islands, I believe, was the first to do that, starting in November of last year. The Caymans followed. Jersey just finished theirs, I believe, last Friday. Montserrat and Turks and Caicos, their public consultations are currently ongoing. I believe they finish. One's on the 15th of May, one's at the end of this month. In the U.S., which is where I'm based, and I've been working on this issue for a couple of years, like I said, the U.S. legislation has not gone anywhere. The Obama administration, in part out of frustration over the lack of inaction and the stalemate in Congress on pretty much every single issue, and also because it's committed, both through the Open Government Partnership, but also because of the G8 Summit and its National Action Plan, is committed to taking meaningful action on this issue. In March of this year, as part of its annual budget announcement, it inserted language that effectively announces a different strategy for collecting this information through the IRS and tax information. It would still require legislation. They seem confident that that this is a greater chance of moving as a legislative vehicle than the previous legislation. So it remains to be seen whether or not that actually is going to move. And then finally, the G20 has picked up on this issue as well. Last year, the G20 communique, when Russia was the presidency, specifically called on countries, or the countries agreed to, in fact, implement the Financial Action Task Force's recommendations. And I know the Australian government, which is that chairs the presidency of the G20 this year and hosts the summit in November, has indicated that beneficial ownership is an issue that is strongly interested in and very much wants to make part of the G20 agenda, and the anti-corruption working group of the G20 has in fact been discussing this in its next meetings in June. So that's the most recent developments on this issue. There's been quite a bit that's happened. So to kick things off, we have a set of questions that we've agreed to, we think would